Welcome, everybody. Our first speaker today is Fiona from Abiandi. She's here. I've seen her come into the meeting. Fiona, lovely. You're the one with the camera on. Lovely. I will also, Fiona, just so you're not looking just at a load of kind of boxes. But the boxes are not a bad thing because it means that we don't overload the. I'm going to say wires. They're not really wires. So
I
Fiona,
appreciate the technical thought.
it's all very technical. Fiona, we're delighted to have you with us this morning. So I'm going to hand straight over to you. You've got your own slides, I think, and assumingly you're happy to drive your own slide pack. Yeah, lovely.
There we go. Can you see them all right?
I can. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. As I go through, Tracy, because I still can't work out on Teams how I can see the slides and you. So if anyone has a question or anything pressing, I'll try and make sure we have a bit of time at the end. But if anyone needs me, if you could shout at me, because I don't think I'll see if people put their hands up.
Yeah, I'll keep an eye on the hands and everything for you.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. My name's Fiona, as Tracy mentioned, and I'm the Services and Safeguarding Lead at an organisation called Abianda. It was really great to hear that you were having this session today about thinking about what's different with assessing girls. And I thought I was going to have to jet off at 10:30, but I can actually stay for a bit. So I'm really glad to hear a bit more about the next session and kind of your plans around this. It's really great to be here. I won't talk too much about who I am specifically, just because of the time we've got, and that's probably not the most interesting part. But my email address will be at the end, and you're welcome to pop me an email if you've got any questions. So what I will cover, it may feel a little bit of a whistle-stop tour, but what I'm going to cover is an introduction to who Abianda are. Some of you may have heard of us, some of you may have not heard of us at all. I'm going to touch on, because I actually think it's a really helpful point when we're thinking about assessing, is to be thinking about language. So I'm going to touch on the terminology of gang, which you'll see kind of relates to our services at Abianda, and we have some input from our Young Women's Advisory Group around that. I'm then going to touch a bit on about why young women and girls are not always being seen, particularly in the work that we do at Abianda around young women and girls who are affected by or at risk of criminal exploitation and associated violence. Why they're often invisibilized. And I try and use that word, even though it may be a made up word, because we sometimes hear young women and girls affected by criminal exploitation being described as invisible. And I think invisibilized helps us remember that actually the responsibility is on the services and systems around them to find them, not on them to reveal themselves. They are there. But I'll then think about unique experiences and indicators of risk for young women and girls, which I hope will be really tangibly helpful to think about when you're thinking about what's different when assessing girls and young women. And because I know I'm coming to this not knowing the detail about what you do already or what plans you might have with assessing, what I'm hoping is that these aspects will inform the conversation we're about to have next, and will help feed in some way. As I said, if you've got questions, I'll try and leave a few minutes at the end to make sure I do that. But anything that we don't get time to cover today, feel free to drop me an email. So an introduction to Abianda. We do a lot of training with services in lots of different ways. We've actually just redeveloped 4 new seminars around working with young women and girls affected by criminal exploitation, another around making the NRM work for young women and girls, another about contextual safeguarding and applying that approach with young women and girls, and a final one about county lines exploitation and the real experiences and impact of young women and girls. And throughout that training and throughout everything we do, participatory principles are really key to our work at Abianda. So you'll see young women's voices threaded throughout a lot of what we do, and the training content that we've just redeveloped has been developed with young women and girls alongside us, both our Young Women's Advisory Group and a lived experience consultant as well. This is a quote we always start a lot of our training with, which is from a young woman who worked with Abianda a little while ago. I imagine while I'm waffling, you probably had a chance to read it. And with this one, I tend to not read it out, as I feel like maybe there's some more impact in you hearing her in your mind, but just to really get us grounded in the work that we do at Abianda. We've done some re-articulation recently of what our approach is, what our services are, how we see that we can be most effective for young women and girls. So if you are aware of us, you might have seen some of that. But essentially, Abianda's vision is that young women and girls are free from oppression and harm caused by criminal exploitation and violence. Our mission, so how we do that, is through these areas. Abianda's just turned 10, And we were initially created because of this, what we saw as a gap in service provision, that there is often a gender bias. And again, it's why I'm really grateful you're having this session today. There's often a gender bias in the way exploitation is identified, which can mean that we're doing a disservice in a number of ways, because what we often see is that services and systems are more able to identify young men and boys who are experiencing criminal exploitation and young women and girls who are experiencing sexual exploitation. And that's not to say that those arms of service are perfect, but that's where we see that identification happening more. And we actually used to hear, and sometimes I still hear, this idea that criminal exploitation isn't something that really happens to young women and girls. And we know that's not the case, but I'll dig into that a bit shortly. So our mission, the way that we do this, is through the provision of specialist one-to-one group work and contextual safeguarding services, which increase safety, skills, and self-advocacy and agency for young women and girls. Working with national and local services to challenge and change their approaches through delivery of our training and systems change programmes. And the construction of a network of young women and girls who can disrupt and redesign policy and practice to create lasting impact. So the direct work we do with young women and girls is really built around that idea of independence and agency. And the other aspects are really about us thinking about how we create the change in the system that they want to see. So what our services look like, and this is another thing that we've done reasonably recently, and I love it, is it's an ecological model. So what we recognise, and this is very much kind of contained within the contextual safeguarding approach, so I'm sure a number of you are very clued up with that, but really comes from this idea that what we're looking to do with the services and the activities that we provide is we're not focusing around this idea of behaviour change. Sometimes we see that services can respond in a way, especially when we're thinking about risk and safeguarding, that looks to see what a young woman and girl can do differently, what we say a young woman or girl should do differently, where she should be spending less time, who she should be not spending time with, who she should spend more time with, these sorts of things. And so that's where that idea of independence and agency really comes from in our one-to-one work. There's this idea of creating a space for a young woman to meet with a practitioner, to work through our structured programme, which has sessions around a number of different things, including thinking about personal values, human rights and human needs, exploring what the concepts of safety and risk mean to her and safety planning from there, thinking about contextual safety planning in the community, relationship mapping that is done very much as a tool for her. So we talk about that, making sure that it's not being done in a way that is surveillance, so she can use initials, icons, emojis, whatever she wants to represent people in her relationship map, as long as she knows who she's talking about. But all these different things we include in our one-to-one work. And that flagship service is based in Islington and works with young women and girls aged 13 to 25. So that's that one-to-one work aspect. And what we recognise is that a part of that one-to-one work often is supporting young women and girls, walking alongside them as they're navigating services and systems, and often places and spaces that aren't created with their safety in mind. Or if they are maybe not quite being able to articulate or understand the complex risk that young women and girls affected by criminal exploitation are likely to be experiencing. So this ecological model means that as well as that one-to-one work, we have group work programmes, we have contextual safeguarding projects, which we're going to be rolling out soon, which is responding to locations where young women and girls have identified there's risk related to criminal exploitation, doing workshops with them to understand what they would like to see happen in those spaces to create more safety, and being able to feed back the decision makers and hopefully make that happen. Training for professionals and that influencing of policy and development. And these sit within this ecological model, so acknowledging that we have a young woman at the centre of everything that we do. We're also thinking about her experience in places and spaces, in services and in systems. And this approach may be something that is already well known to you, or maybe something that is quite useful to think about in an assessment sense. And when I touch on those kind of indicators of risk or vulnerability later, we'll look at them in an ecological sense. So hopefully that will bring another lens to this. And across the top there, you can see some of our participatory activities. As I say, participation gets threaded through everything we do, but we have leadership opportunities for young women. We have a leadership skills programme called Elevate. And we also have a young women's advisory group, which is a group of young women aged 18 to 25 who have lived experience of criminal exploitation and violence or lived experience of oppressive systems. And have this shared interest in working with us to create this systems change. They're very much part of the team, come to all our team meetings. They have a lot of influence over what we prioritise. So Abianda looks like that. And as I say, the one-to-one work is available in Islington. The group work and contextual safeguarding projects are Islington focused at the moment, but will hopefully be rolling out across London, and training and those aspects are available across the UK. We'll come anywhere that people will have us. If you've heard of us before, you may have seen these. These are what I would probably refer to as our founding principles. So some of the things that we hold core, at the core of everything that we do. And again, may hopefully be interesting to think about how you already do these in your practice and your assessing, or whether these are things that can be further embodied. The first one's my favourite. They're all important. But the first one's my favourite, that really understanding that young women and girls are the experts of their own lives. At Abianda, we don't see ourselves as there to tell young women and girls what to do, but instead, like I touched on, create those spaces, bring tools, bring resources that hopefully can offer another lens or a space for reflection that she may not have been able to engage with before. What we do at the beginning of all our work, so as well as participatory principles, as well as a contextual safeguarding approach, we also use solution-focused brief therapy techniques. And I won't have time to go into all of those bits today, but what that looks like at the beginning of work with young women and girls, that solution-focused part especially, is that we ask them what are their best hopes for working with us. How would they know that this had been useful? What would they need to see to know that? And that guides everything that we do. So then the resources and tools that we have, it helps us shape what actually, from what she's telling us, what it sounds like might be useful, what we can take to her, what we can suggest, see what she feels up for. And that's how we guide the work. Sometimes we even put that as, how would you know that working with us hadn't been a total waste of your time? What would you need to know? So just really being able to acknowledge their expertise. They're living their lives 24/7. We'll be seeing them for a short period each week, potentially, but really understanding their expertise and building on that. And with that, hand in hand comes this idea of young women and girls and their innate strengths, innate resources, innate competence, and resilience. And we do a lot of strength-based work, and I'll touch on what that can look like in a moment, just very briefly. But I also love to touch on, I love language. If anyone is already aware of my role at Abianda or has seen me speak, you might know that. But resilience is the one I like to pick up on here, because what we're thinking about resilience as here when we're articulating this is something to be nurtured, something to be supported, something to be acknowledged, but really something to be nurtured. Because sometimes I think we can use resilience in a way that can become a barrier for a young woman or girl to be able to access the support that she wants. When we're acknowledging that young women and girls are resilient, I think it's also important for us to acknowledge what it's taken for them to be resilient, what it's likely they've experienced to get to that stage, things that they probably shouldn't have had to experience, especially when we're thinking in the context of exploitation. And also thinking about making sure that that idea of nurturing resilience is at the centre, rather than seeing young women and girls as strong enough to cope and not in need of the support that they deserve. So just really thinking about how we use that. And then these last three are really about how we shift those power hierarchies. I'll touch on right at the end, the idea of kind of participation as protection, which is hopefully helpful to articulate. But just for the sake of time, I won't talk you through those in detail. But as you can see, really thinking about our participatory principles. So this just kind of sums up who Abianda is, in this idea of shifting the central question. So I touched on that idea of being strengths-based in practice. And again, I imagine there's aspects of that thread throughout what you do too. But really thinking about what is she doing wrong is how we often see risk assessing or safety planning coming, the direction we see it coming from, this idea of what does she need to do differently. As I touched on, sometimes we see this can be articulated in ways of who should she be spending less time with, where should she be stopping going, kind of these limitations or these reflections of what we perceive her as doing wrong. And there's this idea that we have at Abianda about shifting the central question to coming to that conversation from the standpoint of how has she managed to survive? And one thing that an example I give from a practitioner around this is, we had a practitioner who was meeting with a young woman, and I appreciate in the service that we provide, there's some flexibility here. But she was meeting with a young woman. The young woman hadn't been able to attend the last 3 sessions. They'd agreed where this 4th session was going to take place, and the practitioner went. She stayed there, and the young woman turned up 15 minutes before the end. And I'm sure there's lots of feelings going on in our minds as practitioners when those situations are occurring. What that practitioner made sure to do in that situation was to acknowledge that the young woman had made it, There's obviously an aspect of managing expectations about how much time they might be able to have, but acknowledged that she made it, reflected on what was different today that meant she was able to make it. And actually, that meant the young woman shared some of the things that had been going on for her prior to that, all the complexity that she had been navigating in being unable to attend those previous sessions. And that meant that the session went in a direction of, what has it taken from you to be able to do that? What does it say about you that in spite of all those things, you remembered we had an appointment, you made it here, you prioritized this time for yourself. What did it take? So really being able to build on those strengths. And then to be brief on this, though it's something I could speak about for a long time, thinking about the terminology of gang. If you have heard of Abianda before and have known us over this last 10 years, you might know that we had previously articulated our services as being for young women and girls who were affected by gangs. And we use these quotation marks now just through conversation with young women and girls and wanting to acknowledge some of these things that you see starting to be explained on the screen here. We go into more depth about this on our website if people are interested, but we really did some critical reflection around the terminology of gang. For some young women, and you'll have noticed potentially in that quote right at the beginning, this was the terminology used. For some young women, it is what they identify with their experience, and they appreciate the transparency, because I think where it is what's happening, it's important for us to be able to name it. But for a lot more young women, we tend to find that it's a label that's been given to their experience that they don't identify with. And that kind of brings all these questions as to who is it that gets to say that this experience is related to gangs. And I think acknowledge that societally, it's a term that we often see having racist and classist connotations. So some groups of young people will be much more readily identified as a gang by services and systems than others. And it's one that I used to see. I used to be a hospital-based young women's worker for a different organisation. And we would often see sometimes that in the kind of quickness of notation, where there might be significant concerns for a young person, for instance, that kind of a combination of things, let's say that they had a peer group that was significantly older, there was concern about them carrying a weapon, there was concern around substance use, these sorts of things would sometimes get kind of umbrellaed into query gang affiliated on the medical notation. And actually that would lose the actual understanding of that young person's experience because we've lost those key factors that actually are of concern potentially, but would also be stigmatizing and can impact on someone's care going forward. So I thought this might be helpful to bring into when we think about assessment, because I delivered to an NHS team the other day, and this part really inspired some conversation around how they do have on one of their performers that they are told to ask. It does have a question around, are you gang affiliated? It's something that they're asked to ask young people who attend the clinic. And we spoke about actually, what are we looking for there when we're asking that question? What does it enable us to do differently? If a young person says yes to that, is there follow-up questions to understand what that really means for them? What is it that we're looking for? Because actually a yes or no to that question really doesn't move us any closer to understanding that young woman or girl's experience. So just thinking about that, I thought would be interesting. And then because their voices are ultimately much more important than mine, our Young Women's Advisory Group gave us some really great input for our training content recently around their thinking around the terminology of gang. And I will read these ones out, but there's some incredible points here. So thinking about the dangers of adultification. So thinking of them as children being exploited by gangs, not as gang members. The trauma that's associated with being in a gang due to an individual's victimization and offending. So that aspect, which you'll all be very familiar with, of criminal exploitation by nature is the exploitation of young people to commit criminal acts. So actually the trauma associated with that as well. And the Young Women's Advisory Group member here said, I feel like the latter is often not taken into account. The term gang has been stigmatized so much, thinking about the way that it's presented in the media, acknowledging this and how we can make sure that informs us being wary of when we're using it and how we're using it. As I just touched on, the racist and classist connotations with the words and how it can result in a punitive response, which will be traumatic for young women and girls. It can mean that young women and girls are then viewed as perpetrators of harm rather than being seen as victims of exploitation. And again, there's an area there of how often those are both things that are present in a young woman's experience, but we still need to be able to acknowledge her as a victim and survivor. But the important conversation around that I won't dig into today. And then finally, this one's very succinct, but I think it is incredibly impactful. Gangs don't exist in a vacuum. So when we're thinking about poverty, lack of support, abuse, all these things that happen within the context of what we might be describing of a young woman's experience. So why are young women and girls not being seen? We know that from what data shows us, often the number of young women and girls affected by violence that affects young people, and I flip it a bit, we think of this more commonly as youth violence. I think violence affecting young people helps us to remember again about the context that is around these young people. The number of young women and girls identified can be seemingly small compared to boys and young men, and as such, their needs are regularly missed and services are not designed with them in mind. So we have this kind of cycle of young women and girls' experiences not always being acknowledged or identified fully, which then means service provision is not informed, which means they continue not to be identified. So it's really how we think about assessing and how we think about service provision is so important to being able to combat this. Because what we know, and when I touch on the slide about young women's experiences, what we know is that the harm caused by criminal exploitation and the associated violence ripples well beyond what data shows us. We know, as like I just touched on, that young women and girls are navigating these services and systems. They're often designed with boys and young men in mind, so don't always respond to the needs or prioritise the safety of young women and girls in these situations. Thinking about the true extent of harm and the impact on young women's lives, we'll get a sense of that hopefully when I touch on the indicators and the slide around experiences, though I know it is incredibly broad as a topic. But the different ways that young women might be impacted, I just think we have a very limited understanding of at this point. And thinking about young women's previous experience of services with all of those prior points in mind, and how that could lead to actually a damaged trust in services and being able to keep them safe. So young women being made invisible, again, thinking about where the responsibility of that language is. Often services responding to criminal exploitation are built around offending data. And we know actually that that's not always where young women and girls show up in this sense. That can mean that we're not seeing services able to respond early enough to prevent further harm and escalation later down the line for young women and girls. There's a number of things we need to think about how our service currently responds. One there is the concept of adultification bias, which again, I'm sure is something that is known to a lot of you. For more information on that, I definitely direct you to Janine Davis and Nick Marsh, who did some research through an organisation called Listen Up. And adultification bias is thought about in relation to children and young people's experience in a lot of ways. But the way I'm going to zero in on it here in relation to our work and in relation to the session today is thinking about young women, especially Black young women, by the system. Oh, heard myself echo there. How they're perceived by the system. So how often this structural systemic racism there can be in the systems that we have around us all as practitioners can mean that young women are viewed more readily as in need of a punitive response rather than being seen as children and young people, victims of harm that deserve and need a welfare response. So thinking about the victim blaming that can come with that and how they may not be afforded the same pathways to support and what we can do as services to change that. And then they're thinking about challenges in service provision around how a lot of our kind of assessing or service provision looks to think of this binary idea of a victim and perpetrator and how those things are not need to be unpicked when we think about criminal exploitation. And then finally, really thinking about unique experiences and indicators of risk and vulnerability. Now you'll get these slides because I know this is a little small and this is by no means an exhaustive list. But I have a tricky relationship to the idea of indicators because I think sometimes, or for a long time, a lot of the ways that we assessed or a lot of the ways that we approached situations with young people experiencing significant risk was through this kind of idea of indicators. And that's me ticking them off. And I think it's tricky because what I never want people to go away from our sessions thinking is that this is all they need, that this list is all that they need to be able to move closer to young women and girls' experiences. Because I think sometimes only working from indicators can mean that we slide back towards that behaviour change approach rather than seeing the situation as ecological. And it can also mean that we have this sense that we can be observing at a distance what we think is happening for a young woman or girl, rather than using this as means to move closer to her and actually lead from understanding her experience because she's the expert. But the flip side of that is when we're talking about how young women and girls aren't identified as much as they need to be, we need to be able to give services and practitioners and assessments ways to start being able to identify them. So I won't talk to all of these, but as you'll see, we've kind of arranged them in this way of being ecological. So acknowledging that there are things that we might be seeing happening for individual young women and girls, but also thinking about their interaction with places and spaces and how they're treated in those places and spaces, how their safety might be impacted in those places and spaces, thinking about services in the same way, where they might be potentially experiencing harm, thinking about systems as well in a broader sense. So thinking about what sorts of things might be showing up across this ecological model that could mean that young women and girls are at risk of or affected by criminal exploitation and associated violence. And I think interestingly, the slide before, you've noticed we kind of differentiated between an indicator of risk and an indicator of vulnerability. I also think it's really important we think about that idea of vulnerability carefully when we're thinking about indicators, because I wonder if a number of the things that we pull out as indicators of vulnerability would be classed as such if there were no one seeking to exploit these young women and girls. So just being really, I think it's important. I think it's a term that we need when we're thinking about assessment and when we're thinking about creating support and service provision. But I think it's also important we make sure not to inadvertently be placing the problem within the young woman by the way that we use that word. So yeah, I hope that this list will I imagine a lot may not be surprising to you, but some may potentially be kind of granular detail that you hadn't thought about specifically before, but hopefully it will be useful in kind of informing. This is just an example of when I say thinking about these indicators in an ecological sense, going back to that diagram at the beginning. This is, for example, a snapshot of what this could look like. If we think about one young woman, what we might be looking at for her is that there may be some indicators of her experience individually. So you might notice working with her, change in routine and access to money, escalation in mental health crisis. We think about her experience of places and spaces. We might see that she's been found in trap houses or that there is harm happening for her online. We think about her interaction with services. It might look like that she's in supported accommodation or hostels, or that she's been excluded from school. And when we think about her experience of the system, it may be that she's received punitive criminal justice responses or experiences of systemic racism. And so that's just an idea of what it may look like in an individual's experience. And then final slides, as I'm sure I'm coming to the end of my time. This is a slide that we put together with young women and girls in thinking about, again, I'm sure not exhaustive, but really starting to understand the language that we use as services, but also the language that young women and girls are using in relation to their experiences within this context of criminal exploitation and associated violence. There's a few I want to pick out here just because some may seem more direct in terms of the way we understand criminal exploitation affecting young people. So some of these things, for instance, thinking about those financial exploitation aspects, thinking about holding of weapons, drugs or money, thinking about going cunch. So in services, we would think about that as being exploited through county lines. This idea of being exploited to set someone else up within a context of criminal exploitation. And the terminology of honey trap there is one created by the media, which is something that young women wanted us to acknowledge, thinking about the terms that we're using, what they indicate, what they mean. Hood hopping, we think about for young women and girls specifically, and it's probably important to acknowledge in terms of assessing that this idea of moving around, essentially. We often hear this idea of kind of static risk in this area. This is what the risk is. And that is really important to engage with too, where there are specific spaces and places that young women and girls are experiencing risk. But what I've experienced in my practice with young women and girls is that potentially more often for young women and girls than young men and boys in this situation, there is this idea of they may have connections to a number of groups. And there was one young woman I worked with who had been to primary school in one borough and secondary school in another. So she had friendships in a number of areas, but actually that unfortunately led at one point to her being asked to share information about the other. So thinking about how dynamic the risk can be for young women and girls who might be moving between friendship groups, moving between areas. Emotional support and this idea of the relational aspects that so often go unseen or unidentified for young women and girls. When I was a hospital-based young women's worker, we would often see young men and boys come in as the result of really serious assaults, really sadly, stabbings, shootings. I also saw young women and girls come in as a result of all those things, but in smaller numbers. Young women and girls would often come in relation to experiences of sexual violence, unexplained health concerns linked to trauma, or mental health crises, those sorts of aspects. But when young men and boys came in with those significant injuries, almost always the first person they wanted to be called was a young woman, a sister, a friend, a girlfriend, in some situations, an ex-girlfriend. And that young woman would come. She would provide support. She would be there for him. She would support with his interactions with the clinicians, helping to calm him down, remind him of appointments, kind of encourage him to take the medication, those sorts of things, really supporting him through that very traumatic situation. And what that would mean often is that because that support that young woman was giving was so helpful to the clinician's relationship with that young man, she would get lost there. And it wouldn't be considered as to whether she herself was actually at significant risk as a result of this situation, or whether she was vicariously traumatized, what her connection to this situation was and what support she deserved and needed wouldn't always be explored. So thinking about the relational aspects, and to pull that out of this, the concept of debt bondage too, which I won't go into detail with today, as I'm sure it's something you're aware of, but we think about debt bondage directly when a young person is often robbed to be kept in this cycle of owing a debt. But when we think about young women and girls, there can be an added aspect of, for instance, if there is a partner or a brother who may be a victim of debt bondage, they're then moved, relocated to try and increase their safety, or potentially taken into custody. That debt bondage can sometimes, that debt can sometimes fall to her. And at that point, services aren't always looking at her anymore. So just really thinking about the different ways, the relational aspects, the direct and indirect ways that young women and girls might be affected by criminal exploitation and violence. And then I imagine this is something you consider already in your assessing, in your ways of working. But we had some participation training with the brilliant Camille Warrington at Abianda recently, and this just really stuck in my mind. And I thought it'd be useful to bring into the space today, that this idea of participation is protection. That often we see as services that young people's participation in assessments being created about them, in safety planning being done, in meetings being had about them, it is kind of offered, or it's an add-on. They were invited, we asked them, they didn't want to, but actually thinking about how we make sure it's baked in, how we see that our approaches are never going to be sustainable, are never going to be as effective as we want them to be if there isn't an element of participation. And that can start with shared language, that can start with when I think about the terminology of safety planning or assessing, even when we explore those with young women and girls, do we have the same understanding of what that means? When we safety plan at Abianda, we start off by discussing with a young woman the concept of risk, the term risk, the term safety. What does it mean to her? What does it look like? What does it mean to us? Is there similarity there? Is there difference? To make sure that when we're introducing the idea of safety planning, we're talking about the same thing. So thinking about participation in that sense, all the way up to some of the more complex ways of ensuring that young people feel safe and able to engage with everything that's going on around them. This is just a good quote here to hit home the need for that. And then this will be the rest of your session, so you don't need to feed back to me now, and I may have run over a couple of minutes, so especially not. But we always kind of end our training sessions or deliveries with trying to think about reflecting on what you might take away. What you are already doing well, potentially, is also a very solution-focused, strengths-based way of bringing that to an end. What you're already doing well, but also what you take away and implement in your practice. And as promised, that is me, but I'm going to stick around for a little bit longer. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Fiona. That's really interesting and giving lots and lots of food for thought about, especially in terms of how you reframe that question about how the girls managed to survive. I'll open it up briefly for, well, not that briefly, but I'll open it up for questions if anyone's got any questions for Fiona. So she will be sending the slide pack to me. I will in due course be sending that out to everybody. I've also put in the chat it's called constructive resettlement, but it's actually not to do with constructive resettlement, but it's a really nice animation about the adultification concept and what the impact for children and young people. So I'll open it up to anyone who's got any questions for Fiona then. Just put your hand up. No one? Okay, if there isn't any questions, I'm going to carry on then. So Fiona is staying with us, so I think you could probably drop a question into the chat if you've got a specific question for Fiona. As I say, the contact details will come out to you. So there we go. There's not a question, but a comment. So a comment from Rebecca to say we've had some fantastic training delivered by Fiona. So that's really nice to get some feedback for you, and just to kind of obviously you're London based and the services you're offering is brilliant for the London girls and young women, but you know, a need for something across the whole of the country as well. So okay, I'm going to hand over to, oh, there we go, Sophie.
Sorry, just dead quick. Fiona, what's your minimum of participants on the training?
Oh, that's a good question. We're pretty flexible. I can pop in the chat. I mean, you're welcome to email me and I'll direct you to her. But I have a colleague who deals with all of our kind of training inquiries and booking those things in. I can pop her email in the chat and she'll be able to give you all the rundown.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you.
I mean, it might be something you might want to think about on a regional basis or join up with a neighbouring youth justice service, because in terms of just the impact, there's no reason why you can't do that. And I think that would be a really good approach to have, especially if you've got courts that go across different youth justice services. I think that's would be a worthwhile approach to have.
Amazing.
Okay, so I'm going to hand over in an email this morning. I said, "Our Jenny" is what I said. So our Jenny from who is works in the northeast of the country is going to lead the next session in terms of specifically thinking about what we need to be thinking about when we're assessing girls. So I'll ask her to share her screen in a minute, but I just want to pick up where this came from. This actually came from a comment from the last meeting that about how are we thinking about assessing girls and how they ended up in custody and what we're thinking about assessing girls. And that really kind of started me thinking about what are we doing? How are we thinking about assessing girls? And sometimes we'll see in an assessment, this is a, 15-year-old girl, and it doesn't really dig down into what that really means to that child, what their life experience is, and what impact that might have on how you engage with them. So that's someone in this group kind of lit the spark that then led to going away and thinking about it in more detail. But Jenny is far more able to discuss that with you than I am. So Jenny, the floor is yours.
Thank you, our Tracy. So Tracy sometimes calls me young Jenny as well, which is not accurate, but very flattering. So I'll take that one as well.
Our young Jenny.
Our young Jenny. That's brilliant. Okay, so I'll just share my screen. Can you all see that okay?
Yeah, it might help to put it on slide. Yeah, that's it.
We're there.
Thank
We're
you.
there.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Tracy, and thank you, Fiona, as well. I mean, you've touched on so much and really dug deep into the exploitation angle, and I will kind of mention that about your experience in that area and so many things about how we think about girls and I think as well about how girls view themselves that we really, really kind of want to dig into. I mean, the fact this group exists at all, it just shows that we do recognise that something different's needed when it comes to assessing and working with girls. So I want to kind of reflect on that a bit today. I'll just give you a very brief overview of kind of who I am and why it's me talking to you today. So I am the Youth Justice Oversight Manager with the YJB for the North East and Cumbria. But prior to coming to work for the YJB, back in 2023, I was in education for over 20 years. So I was a secondary teacher in schools in the North East and more recently an assistant principal and head of sixth form. So that experience and also being the parent to two now 17-year-old girls has really given me a bit of an interest in how the world treats girls and the many ways in which they're disadvantaged. That also led me into campaigning and volunteering for girls and women's organisations. I was a member of the successful No More Page 3 campaign, and I founded a charity called Woman Up, which has a sister organisation, Young Woman Up, which is based in Carlisle. I'm now a trustee of that charity. So, as Tracy mentioned, International Women's Day is coming up on the 8th of March. So very, very timely for this session. Now, I was a history teacher, but I'm not going to give you too much of a history lesson, but I will mention that International Women's Day has been celebrated since 1911, but was recognised by the United Nations in 1977, which is actually the year that I was born, as a day, so not that young, Tracy, sorry, as a day for advocating for gender equality and women's rights. And I just think it's really interesting to reflect on how far women and girls have come since then, and what hasn't changed, or hasn't changed enough, or has not changed quickly enough. And that kind of leads into this year's theme for International Women's Day, which is Accelerate Action, and recognising the need to take swift, decisive steps to achieve gender equality, and calling for increased momentum and urgency to address systemic barriers and biases that women face. And of course, those are barriers that girls face. So this really kind of struck me, and I think this is quite a stark figure, really. And this is across the world. At the current rate of progress, it will take until 2158 to reach full gender equality, and that's from data from the World Economic Forum. It's about 5 generations. So whilst we recognise that we've come a long way, for our girls, the girls that we're working with, we are a long way away from gender equality, and that's something that I think is worth reminding ourselves of. Tracy and I have had lots of sort of conversations around this, and you know, we recognise that we've come a long way, and I think, you know, as women ourselves, we were sort of reflecting on the fact that sometimes we just don't think about it. We just accept that the world is the way it is, our lives are the way they are, and we just kind of get on with it. But to think about the girls and the young women that we have in front of us, I think it's something that we really need to pay attention to in terms of the inequality, the biases, the unconscious bias, the way the world treats them, the messages that girls get constantly from the world around them, and really kind of pay attention to that when we're assessing girls. So I'm going to actually come back to this bit, I think, a bit later on. I'm just conscious of time, but what I'd like you to sort of to do is reflect a little bit on how the experience of being a girl differs from the experience of being a boy. And of course, we deal largely in youth justice with boys, and we're very good at dealing with boys, and we know what we're dealing with. And that's not to say that all boys are the same and all girls are the same. It's not a homogenous group. But when it comes to girls, there are clearly differences. And I think it's just really worth, for you as practitioners, for all of us, just reflecting a little bit on how are those life experiences different for the girls that you work with. And I know many of you have set up girls groups and so on. You're big, you know, you really are kind of giving some thought to that in terms of recognizing some of those differences, and thinking particularly about some of those pressures and harms in today's society that disproportionately affect girls. And how, as Fiona said, I think so eloquently, some of those differences are invisible. We take them for granted. They're at a structural level. We don't notice those things with girls, perhaps in the same way as we do with boys. And also to say it's far more complex than a binary, of course. We need to take into account the experience of trans and non-binary children, and all of the different things that make up that child in front of you, that individual in front of you. But thinking kind of at a structural level, and the ways in which society treats girls, is something I think it's really important for us to do, and perhaps something we don't always take the time, or have the time perhaps more accurately, to do. So in terms of youth justice then, so these are the Youth Justice Annual Stats for 2023 to 24, and girls continue to make a minority in youth justice, and that kind of struck me as well in terms of some of the things that Fiona was saying. You know, perhaps there's that greater visibility of boys and that greater kind of awareness of boys. Girls, nationally, the percentage of girls remains pretty low, fairly static, 15%. of children coming into youth justice are girls, but we know that services are telling us, many services are telling us, that they've got more girls on their caseload and that those numbers have gone up. Many services are telling us that they've got more girls, particularly in the prevention and diversion space. More services are recognising that girls have distinct needs and experiences and have therefore set up girls' groups, as many of you have done. So thinking specifically about assessing girls then, Asset Plus is asking for us to look at the key influences on a child's self-identity. And that feels really relevant when we consider some of the examples of the distinct life experience of girls. So note that race and ethnicity is quite rightly mentioned as an example here, but gender isn't. And gender is one of the key ways in which a child or young person might define themselves. And that's going back to really little children, isn't it? I'm thinking of my own children here and how that kind of, that I am a girl kind of experience. So it's really important that we consider this element when assessing girls and boys in terms of their gender identity. Looking at the prevention and diversion tool, we're asking practitioners to consider anything in a child's history that might affect their life chances. We know that trauma and abuse are much more likely to be experienced by girls. The diversity needs of the child. Again, gender's got a key role to play here. And any discrimination a child has been affected by. And we know that girls are subject to all kinds of discrimination on the basis of their gender. So it's absolutely critical that we consider all of this when we're assessing girls. So when using assessment tools, some of the things we might need to consider, and we can have some sort of more further discussion around this at the end when we reflect on your own practice. But some of the things I've kind of pulled out here, when we're looking at Asset Plus, gender is a key influence on self-identity. So it's likely to have impacted on how a girl views herself, how she views the world, how she views other girls, both consciously and unconsciously. Girls are likely to have a complex history. Of course, this is the case for many children who come into youth justice, but gender is likely to play a part, or discrimination is likely to play a part in that experience, that life experience of a girl. They may view themselves and the world differently than boys do, and that might mean factors affecting desistance could also be different for girls. And of course, we're coming back to that child first approach. Of course, we're coming back to viewing that child as an individual, but taking some of this into account when we're looking at girls. With the P&D tool, the impact of a child's history, a girl is more likely to have experienced trauma and abuse, and they need to be explored. The diversity needs of the child is closely linked to a girl's gender, and discrimination is a given at a structural level. It's more likely on a personal level in numerous ways as well. So there's some of the things that we might want to consider with girls. And like Tracy said, we want something a bit more than this is a 15-year-old girl. We want to have some of that exploration. We want to have some of that consideration of some of the ways in which these life experiences may have affected, and some of them will have affected, the girl sitting in front of you. So when thinking about some of the unique needs of girls in assessments, I was drawn to some of the sections on discrimination and life experience, and reflecting on what that may have, some of those experiences that girls would have been more likely to have had than boys. And I was struck by, there's a basic level of discrimination that all girls will have experienced because they are girls. And Fiona touched upon some of that in terms of that structural level, stereotyping and so on. And then there's a layering on of other forms of discrimination and experiences that many, or perhaps even most girls will have experienced, and additional experiences that will possibly have affected some of the girls in front of us. And that interplay and the impact of this discrimination experience will be unique for each girl, but there is a need to consider this. And then when we sort of layer in intersectionality of other protected characteristics, such as race, that becomes a much more complex picture, and the assessment needs to take that into account. It's also worth mentioning, I think, that all of this affects and plays into how others, including professionals, perceive girls. So the expectations of how girls should behave are very much bound up in their discrimination, their self-identity, and how we view them and work with them. So just some food for thought there. Thinking about then all girls and what that experience is of being a girl in the world today, and a girl in the United Kingdom today. So although it might affect them in different ways, there are ways in which all girls are discriminated against at a structural level. Gender norms and stereotypes dictate certain roles for and expectations of girls, and these are established pretty much from birth. And again, when we layer in race, for example, or other protected characteristics, that becomes even more the case. We only have to look at how we dress boys and girls differently to consider what that means in terms of how passive or active we expect them to be. Look at the toys that children are expected to play with, that sort of pink aisle versus the blue aisle, different toys that are designated as for boys or girls. And that all might seem pretty harmless, but it does reinforce expectations for girls and boys that play out later in life. So the gender pay gap in 2024 was still at 13%. Men tend to progress higher and further in most professions, despite the fact that girls have higher attainment than boys. And even in female-dominated sectors, such as teaching, women are less likely to progress into leadership. So a DFE study in 2022 found that female teachers were 20% less likely than their male counterparts to become head teachers. And of course, school being one of the places where girls learn about society and what they can be or who they can't be. So representation in society at large and in schools contains implicit messaging to girls about their role and value in society, and that affects their aspirations, the way in which they view themselves, and that's further reinforced by society. A study in 2018 found that career advice in schools was often gendered, even when delivered by female teachers. And then studies into working class girls' aspirations have found they often feel they have very limited options, are less likely to want to stay on at school. So when we consider the intersection of other factors such as class or race or care experience, these can further limit expectations and aspirations of girls. So all of this affects how society views and treats girls and how they view themselves. Attitudes towards consent among young people, really, really worrying. And that's something, I was very much aware of when I was in education. I'm sure that's something that you were very much aware of as well. And the fallout from that is really, really damaging. Gender double standards sees boys encouraged to have multiple sexual relationships, whereas girls are shamed, often by other girls. So that peer policing of sexuality is really widespread, perhaps even more so in the online world, and the vile and abusive language used about girls, often by girls, suggests an internalized misogyny and shame, and that sort of hatred that's directed towards girls. Online porn, widespread availability with really disturbing, really violent content has been linked to harmful sexist attitudes and behaviours towards girls, and girls and their male peers are exposed to and influenced and harmed by this. Objectification of girls and women's widespread across media and social media. Look at the way that women are represented in advertising, in music, in gaming. Those messages are everywhere, and girls and their male peers are kind of flooded with all of this messaging, and that misogyny is consistently reinforced. And we really do need to think about the impact of this on girls' self-esteem and sense of identity. The influence of incel culture and toxic masculinity on the attitudes and behaviour of boys towards girls is of massive concern. And no doubt you've seen this, and that amplifies and increases the risk of sexism and harm towards girls. An Observer investigation in 2022 found that TikTok's algorithm targets teen boys with misogynistic content, such as Andrew Tate clips. No surprise there. Videos of Andrew Tate have in excess of 11 billion views. Rape culture, where perpetrators of sexual violence are rarely brought to justice. Survivors are disbelieved or seen to be to blame in some way for their assault, is really, really damaging to girls. And these attitudes are widespread in real life and online, and they impact on girls in multiple ways, including how they view themselves and other girls. At the same time, it's widely perceived that girls are not safe, and therefore behaviours and freedom of movement are limited or inhibited to avoid falling victim to a violent stranger, despite the fact that most women and girls who are harmed or even killed are victim to someone they know. And actually, Tracy and I were having a conversation about some of those kind of I've seen this a few times recently in terms of, if you have an audience and you sort of ask women and men, what steps do they take on a day-to-day basis to keep themselves safe? And that whole kind of culture of, texting your friend when you get home and so on, and just that sense of girls and women not being safe. And then we sort of layer into that beauty culture, diet culture, that idea that girls should look and behave a particular way, that they should be a particular size and shape, those kind of impossible beauty standards, and the huge amount of kind of commercial pressure to buy all of these products for your skin and your hair and your diet culture, and young girls and women trying to sort of change the way that they naturally look more and more so, I think, and social media's role in that, and that body shaming, and pressure on girls to conform to that, and that bullying of girls, again, often by girls because they're internalizing those kind of attitudes and behaviors. A report that looked at the mental health and well-being of young people talked about, this is done by the Education Policy Institute and the Prince's Trust, was looking at the mental health and well-being and looked at sort of how social media in particular had a big role to play in how young people feel. And again, not really a surprise, but the research which looked at 11, 14 and 17-year-olds in England showed that the well-being of all young people declines by the end of their teenage years, but that declines much greater for girls. And by the age of 14, girls' well-being and self-esteem falls dramatically. So that leads into some of the double standards and in terms of behavior and expectations, and that's something that we see play out at school as well in terms of expectations of how girls should behave versus if they step outside of those expectations. So those societal pressures, gender stereotyping, damaging sexist views towards girls affect all girls because they are so prevalent. There's no escape for girls, particularly when we look at how they're bombarded with these views online. And that particular way in which girls experience the world needs to be taken into account when we assess girls. And there's just some stats there. I will send these out, but this is some research. Every year the Girl Guiding does a survey on girls' attitudes and gathers information about lots of things and how they view the world and the environment and so on, but some of the pressures that girls face online I thought were really sad in terms of their concerns, their worries, the expectations of them. They're supposed to look a certain way, how they kind of filter their images and so on. And that's just all of the girls that we have in front of us are existing within that world and within those pressures. Okay, I'm going to go through a couple more slides. I'll put a break in a bit so we can have a bit of a comfort break, and I'm conscious that I'm kind of talking at you and could go on for hours, which I promise you I won't do, but it really resonates with me as a woman, and also I think as a parent, and it very much did so as a teacher as well, just how awful and tragic it is that girls have these impossible expectations they just cannot win, and these attitudes, these expectations mean that girls are more likely to experience discrimination. That discrimination is happening within that lens, and particular types of harm that they may experience because of that discrimination. And we need to consider and explore this when we're assessing girls. Sexual harassment. 59% of 13 to 21-year-old girls and women have experienced sexual harassment, according to last year's Girl Guiding study. An Ofsted report in 2021 found that 9 out of 10 girls had received unsolicited images and had been subject to sexist name calling. Again, this probably doesn't come as any surprise, but I think it is worth us reminding ourselves of this. A study undertaken in 2011 found that sexual harassment in schools isn't taken as seriously as other forms of bullying. It's almost just accepted, isn't it, that that's just what happens. It's just boys being boys, just get on with it. A study by Plan International found that girls don't feel safe in the classroom, online or on the streets. And as many as 65% of women and girls have experienced some form of street harassment. I suspect it's actually higher in reality, many describing the first time that they were catcalled having taken place when they were in school uniform. Violence and sexual violence is more likely to affect girls. In the UK, 1 in 4 women have experienced domestic abuse and 1 in 4 have been raped. 2/3 of domestic abuse victims in the UK are female, and 8% of women aged 17 to 74 experience sexual abuse before the age of 16. Intimate partner violence is most prevalent in young adult heterosexual relationships, and research from the University of Bristol and the NSPCC shows that 25% of girls aged 13 to 17 have experienced the use of physical force in a relationship, and 72% had experienced emotional abuse. And again, when we reflect on that, it probably doesn't come as a huge surprise, but also it's something that is so perhaps normalized or accepted that it's worth us taking the time to reflect on and consider it in terms of the girls that we have in front of us. Witnessing domestic violence and coercive control from one parent to the other, usually male to female, reinforces those gender stereotypes and violence against women and girls, to boys and to girls. Sexist gendered views affect girls' access to healthcare and women's access to healthcare. The Women's Health Strategy for England, published in 2022, recognised that health disparities in women's health across the country, which further impact marginalised groups. The assumption that autism and ADHD are conditions that mainly affect boys has left girls and non-binary children without a diagnosis or receiving a late diagnosis. There is greater awareness of neurodivergence in girls, but that has affected and continues to affect recognition and assessment and access to all kinds of healthcare that's layered into. The Mental Health Foundation found that the mental health of young women and girls has deteriorated and the gap between men and women has widened. They reported that young women are 3 times more likely to experience common mental health problems than young men. Girls' attendance in schools, growing cause of concern. University College London found that girls' mental health was disproportionately affected by the pandemic. They're more likely to have taken on additional caring responsibilities. So it's not surprising really to see that within the data, female pupils have experienced a greater rise in overall persistent and severe absence since the pandemic. So all of this resulting from societal gender discrimination affects many girls and is more likely to affect girls than boys. The likelihood they've experienced violence or sexual violence, inequality of access to healthcare and education has to be considered when we're assessing girls. And again, the ways in which additional vulnerabilities impact on this is a factor. Okay, and just some figures there from 2019 to suggest that 1/4 of women have experienced childhood abuse. And some of the stigma around this as well affects reporting, and we know how difficult it is for survivors to report, and that features into this. So sometimes, we might suspect that those figures are actually higher. And then moving on to things that could affect some of the girls in front of you, and we've heard about the risk of exploitation and the necessity to consider that not only sexual exploitation could affect girls, but also that criminal exploitation, and that's something that needs to be considered in assessments. Sexual health and pregnancy. 15-year-old girls were the group who had the highest uptake of vaping last year, and we know that girls are more likely to self-harm and that self-harm rates have gone up. Study in 2018 found that a fifth of 14-year-old girls self-harmed at some point, and young women are 3 times more likely than young men to experience PTSD. Young women from disadvantaged groups face the greatest risks, and those who have more than one risk factor, for example, Black transgender girls, bear a particularly complex set of challenges, and these are things that we need to take into account. When we look at some of the messaging towards girls and the increased likelihood that they'll experience violence and sexual violence, that's perhaps not surprising, especially when we lay in other protected characteristics. We know self-harm is often a coping mechanism and a way of internalizing shame, trauma, and rejection. Eating disorders, there was a sharp increase for girls during and following the pandemic, and the rate of girls is 4 times higher than that for boys of eating disorders. Young carers, it's difficult to get a clear picture of young carers. There's been a lot of criticism around census data, school census data, in underestimating that issue. But given gender stereotyping, that really resonated what Fiona said around that kind of expectation on girls and women to be the carers. And that's sometimes a role that girls will fall into in a household. And that kind of mental load and that emotional labour that girls are just expected to carry out, and how that may make them more likely to be, for example, having to care for younger siblings. Just as women and girls are more likely to be the victim of violence and sexual violence than boys and men, they're more likely to be murdered by a partner or ex-partner. And we've got lots of statistics around adult women, but it's not difficult to draw a parallel for girls in terms of that risk, given the likelihood that they are more likely to experience violence in a relationship or from a family member. Forced marriage and non-based abuse also disproportionately affect girls, and the new government has set an ambitious target to halve violence against women and girls within the next decade. There's been an increase in school exclusions for girls, and particularly for girls of mixed and Black Caribbean heritage. Research by Gender Alliance in 2022 suggested that girls who misbehave can be treated more punitively than boys because they're contravening gender norms. For Black and minoritized girls, this is exacerbated by racial bias, including adultification, where they're viewed as more mature and less innocent than their white peers. So again, a whole load of things to consider in assessment of girls. What I'm going to do in the next part of the session, I'm just going to stop sharing because I'm going to give you a break from listening to me talking. So losing my mouse here. So what I'm going to do is give you a bit of a break to go and have a comfort break, grab a cup of tea, and then I promise I'll talk at you a little bit less in the second section, when we'll have a chance to maybe reflect upon practice and very much in terms of what you're doing already. I'm really keen to hear about that, to take into account some of these things that are more likely to affect girls, and also thoughts and things that you might take away from today's session in your assessment processes. So if we say we'll come back at 20 past, so it's 11:12 now, so if you can be back on for 20 past, and we'll start the next bit then, but give you a bit of a comfort break and a bit of a break from listening to me. All right.
Thank you. We'll see you at 20 past, everybody. Okay, I'm back. Are other people back? Give me a thumbs up, like a, not that one. Give me a brilliant. So give me one of those ones. Okay, lovely. Thank you.
I think we'll get going. We're back in the room. We'll get going. I just noticed in the chat there was a couple of questions about the stats, and yes, I will be sharing. I'm putting them together into a PDF. There's a lot of stuff out there. All of the research points to this direction in terms of the impact on girls' self-esteem, the impact on girls, these disadvantages that girls face. So I'm putting it all together in a document for you. So we'll share that with the slides as well, so you've got access to that. I'll just share my screen again. I've got a few more slides to go through before we then reflect on practice, which I'm really, really keen for us to have the chance to do. So I will share my, okay, hang on, it's just, there we go. Can we see that?
Yes, thank you, Jenny.
Yeah, fabulous. Okay, so I'm just gonna actually go up. Yeah. So sort of thinking about all of this, and thinking about, you know, the links between ACEs and trauma and poverty, school exclusions and other vulnerabilities and children coming into youth justice, it's not perhaps surprising that we don't have more girls in youth justice. The report by the Local Government Association in 2024 on girls involved in youth violence reinforces an awful lot of what we've talked about today, and particularly thinking about some of those root causes and drivers of what's being seen in terms of violence and girls. And I think, again, to really kind of reinforce that point that Fiona made in terms of that false binary between victim and perpetrator, that to consider that so many of these girls are victims in so many ways. So just to sort of think about some of those disproportionalities and the links and the clear links between those and violence by girls. And you know, the ways, when we look at the ways in which girls are discriminated against and harmed, it is a pretty bleak picture, and it's something that, you know, when you stop and think and you stop and look, it is really can be quite disheartening. And it is something we need to be aware of when we are dealing with girls as a distinct group, whilst also considering the other vulnerabilities and intersectionalities that they have or may have, and being prepared to explore that with the girl in front of you and her voice in that. We've got some key recommendations here by the Local Government Association from their report, and one of the things is that they reference is obviously, you know, all of these things we would expect, we would want. It's like a wish list, isn't it? You know, this is nothing new. This is nothing that we don't think that we want to be able to offer to our children, but nonetheless, you know, to consider how these are linked to the research and the need for, in particular, gender informed intervention, trauma informed practice, culturally informed support, that we are, and co-production and so on, that we are seeing these girls as individuals and also recognizing what it means to be a girl, what it means to be a girl in the world today. So just some recommendations there from the Local Government Association about some of the things that they think will be effective. You know, and we're seeing the same thing again here. Children and Young People Centre for Justice produced a policy and practice guide. This was actually for working with girls in Scotland back in 2015. So it's 10 years old. It's produced for the Scottish system, but the guidance is based on research, and it really does support what we've said today. And I've highlighted that point at the top. Girls require a more individualised and gender-specific assessment process. There's further things that they've picked out there, but we're hearing the same message again and again based on the research. We can see some of those structural inequalities playing out in girls' victimisation, linked to offending behaviour, low self-esteem, mental and emotional health. Those things are prevalent amongst girls that come in to youth justice. Those things are prevalent amongst girls. They're prevalent because of some of the structural inequalities that we've talked about. So just to sort of be mindful of that in our assessment processes and in the ways in which we work with girls. I really like the fact that the CYJC report also pulled out, and this is based on Child Voice carried out with girls in Glasgow, the things that girls were saying that they wanted: a safe and nurturing environment. We talked actually about some of those barriers to attendance, being really mindful of those. Interventions responsive to our needs, tailored interventions to specific concerns and needs. Something there as well about opportunities to achieve academically. We've talked about low aspirations for girls, and when we think about how magnified that often is with girls in youth justice, you know, that's really key and important, that strengths-based approach, that future thinking. And our potential of positive change is underpinned by the quality of the relationships we establish. We know that girls respond to workers that are caring and nurturing, that, you know, we're looking at children who very often feel shame, feel excluded, feel unloved. So the necessity of working with girls in a way that supports them. And promoting learning and support shared activities. I know some of you, and I've spoken to some of you about the girls groups that you've established, and you know, the sort of journey you've been on with them, where you've had kind of a bit of maybe suspicion between the girls to begin with, but kind of breaking down those barriers and actually, you know, working with girls and how good they are at relationships and how they have gone on to support one another. I've spoken to one practitioner whose girls group, the girls who've kind of almost graduated from one of the groups have been involved in mentoring of girls in future groups. So those things, and working with girls' strengths and resilience, which I thought was a really important point that Fiona was making, you know, isn't it amazing, given what they have to deal with, that girls manage so well despite it. So some sort of final thoughts from me then. It's clear that girls have specific and complex needs related to their gender, and they are exacerbated by the intersection of other vulnerabilities. So they are a distinct group, and that means that they require a gender-informed assessment process. Structural inequalities, unconscious bias, and pressures. And I use that word pressures a lot because I just think of how many pressures there are on girls. And when we think of, you know, the physical world and the online world, you know, a lot of this in terms of body shaming and violence, it's nothing new. This is not something that girls are suddenly now experiencing that they weren't experiencing previously because of the online world. However, the online world means in many ways, and for many girls, there's just no escape from it. So that being bombarded with that messaging constantly, and the sort of that sinister nature of the algorithm that will actually pick out things for them, and to boys as well, reinforce those disadvantages and that discrimination. And of course, again, just to really hammer home that point, which I know we're all aware of, these things are exacerbated when other intersectionalities come into play. The fact that girls are more likely to experience trauma, relationship violence, sexual violence, health inequality, and other disadvantages is something we really do need to take into account, specifically when we assess girls. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing now. And what I'd really like to do at this point is to have some conversations about this. As I say, I will share these stats with you, so you'll get sort of some detail about all of this. And there's, for all of the stats that I've gathered, there's probably about 30 more for each thing that I could have included, but I will send these out to you. What I'd like to do now is just reflect a little bit and really kind of think about, first of all, what are you doing well with girls? And I think that's a really important place to start, because I know that you are, and I know there's some absolutely fantastic practice going on. So thinking specifically in your assessment processes with girls, it would be great to hear from some of you before we then move on to perhaps what else we could potentially do and things that we could take away. So does anybody want to jump in and share some of the ways in which they assess girls perhaps differently, or whether they kind of do that, or even, you know, perhaps if you don't? So hands up if anybody would like to share something they're doing with girls in that assessment space in particular. I've sent them all to sleep, Tracy.
You haven't, they're all there. I've hovered over whether we want to put them into rooms for this, or whether we want to do it as a whole. But I think we can do it as a whole, because that way people can really share with the whole group about what we're thinking about when we're assessing girls.
We can open it up more broadly as well, because I know there's an awful lot to think about there. So has anybody just got any general questions, comments, observations about assessing girls? It may well be, you know, that this is something that you're kind of thinking, yeah, actually, maybe we want to do more. Thank you so much. Is it Islay?
Hi, it's Isla.
Isla, sorry.
No worries, no worries. I'm relatively new to youth justice. I'm a seconded probation officer, and a project that I've just picked up is setting up a group for young women in our service, with the hope of sort of helping and supporting them. And I suppose for me, it's just about, because I've only got one woman on my caseload, young woman on my caseload at the moment, and she's coming to the end of her order now. I suppose it's more of an observation really, but what struck me is how long it's taken to get her to the point where she's ready to talk. So, you know, I think some of the points you've raised are really interesting, and I'm just trying to absorb it all so that I can take it forward when we do manage to get a group together, because I think just giving the young women that space to talk where, you know, they may not have had that space previously is really important.
Thank you for that. Yeah, you're absolutely right, and that is such a challenge, isn't it? Because we're talking about some really difficult life experiences, and you know, you're in that assessment space, and you're wanting to get to know a girl and work with her, and that trust is something that is so key to build up, and such a challenge, isn't it? Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Davinia.
Put my camera on because can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah,
and we can see you.
Yeah, I put my camera on because I always think it's better that you can see somebody if they're talking to you. Yeah, it's complex. It is complex, isn't it? Because I think you start from the point of an assessment should be personalised anyway, shouldn't it? From girl to girl, you know, boy to boy, etc., etc. So it's really about it's about doing your homework as well, isn't it? I guess, and I know that we have limited information on girls when they come through, you know, either throughout the court or in a court setting, or, you know, a prevention setting, isn't it? And I think, you know, your homework getting to that point of actually assessing a girl and thinking about your approach rather than just another assessment, going from here to there, and allowing yourself some space to think about the girl or the child that you are assessing. And I know this is banded about youth justice quite a lot, isn't it? But if that was your child, you're going to see somebody's child. So entering that assessment as though you were going to see, you know, your own girl, and what approach would you take towards your own child? And I think, you know, all yachts will be different, but we're in a very rural yacht. So a lot of the, you know, the visits are to the home within the community. And I think, you know, in the assessment stage, it's all about looking at where is comfortable, you know, because, you know, you've already alluded to many of the factors that affect girls, you know, from trauma to relationships to a lot of other things, really, and giving that extra headspace really to what would help that girl. And just quickly, I have been listening, but I've just picked up a feedback form, and I'll touch on this bit because it's really interesting. Sort of the feedback is had an amazing bond with the worker from our so what's been good about coming to the yacht? So had an amazing bond with the worker, gained good trust with her, and could openly talk about how I feel and not have to feel worried. Had really good fun and chat, and also learning more things, and what she's reflected on, what's been bad about coming to the yacht and why has it been bad? Nothing bad. And this is where it's coming to the assessment. Just early appointments were tiring. And if you analyse that, isn't it? If you analyse, yeah, it's a totally different headspace for children when, you know, they have to then spend possibly, you know, 45 minutes to an hour with one practitioner, and how you do that as well, how, you know, the length of time that you give to assessments, because for children it can be, you know, really long, can't it? So yeah, just that's just a little bit for me.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, isn't it? And that kind of almost re-traumatizing effect where we don't want to put girls through that. We want to build that trust, and that is one of the really big challenges, isn't it, in assessment, is trying to capture what is happening with that child, but also appreciating that this is a really difficult situation for them, and and building that trusting relationship and so on. And it is an absolutely huge challenge. And I think some of this stuff as well, the more general structural stuff, this is the stuff that girls aren't necessarily even aware of. So this isn't something they're going to be able to sit there and say to you, well, I'm subject to body shaming online, and the sexual harassment going on in the corridors in my school, and and all of that, and I'm in a relationship, and actually there's emotional abuse and coercive control going on in that relationship, and so all of that as well. I think there is an element, isn't there, perhaps of, whilst not wanting to make an assumption, but taking to that assessment that knowledge that this is the life experience of girls today, that this is happening, so that these things are perhaps the basis of the relationship that you form with that child, in terms of things like self-esteem work, building that identity and so on. And I think that's really important, isn't it? And absolutely recognise those challenges, definitely. Sherry, you were next.
Yeah, I would just firstly wanted to say how important it is and how good it feels to be spending 2 hours today just talking about the importance of women and girls. We just don't do that very often. And in our line of work, and I'm from Haringey Youth Justice, and I've been in youth justice for 20 years. And when I first started, our numbers were so much larger and we had more girls. And I felt like we were, in a weird way, better at it a few years ago because we had so much focus. Like I did both youth work and then became a social worker, but I did lots of considered gender specific work with girls. But now I'm working in a yacht where we have about 75 children, and the majority, I'd say 89% of them are boys. So a huge amount of our work is dedicated to working with Black boys and working with boys specifically. And when we look at gender specific work and incels and online misogyny, it's very much from the position of who it's aimed at and not at the victims of it and who it's impacting so significantly. And it's just very, I think today you've riled me up a bit, which is good, because I've come today specifically because I was really, really interested in it. But some of you, we were inspected recently, we had our report come out, and it was really clear. They were asking us, what do you do for girls? And we're like, well, we're good at, I will say our assessment process is sensitive and thoughtful, and it's, we think about social graces and we do think about things. But having kind of gone through what you've kind of said today, I just feel very much, but do we really think about it in terms of that when we talk about identity for girls, our identity as women and girls is so much more prevalent than everything else because of the impact of our place in the world. So what we do in our youth justice service is we have a thing called Team Space, where every 2 weeks we do a sort of a learning opportunity and people share. And I will 100% be taking, some of the stuff that I've learned here today and kind of building how we assess for young women and girls. We might not have a lot of them, and we really don't. And I think that's why it sometimes feels like a back foot, but it shouldn't. And I think we tend to work, when we're thinking about girls, it's very much from a victim perspective, and I want it to be far more empowering, even if we don't have that many on our books. I just it's been really good day. Thank you so much for what you've shared with us. I've really learned and been galvanized by it, so I appreciate it. Thank you.
Always good when people go away angry, isn't it, Sherry?
100%.
Righteous anger. No, absolutely. And I think it's taking that space and that time to just reflect on it, isn't it? And recognise that children from some groups and girls are a distinct group, and that's such a part of their identity, do have particular and specific needs, and that's really important. And every child is an individual. We must have that child first approach, but within that there are certain things that we recognise will disproportionately affect certain groups, and it's really important that we are mindful of that. We don't lose sight of that. Pippa.
Oh yeah, sorry, I thought I'd turn my camera on so you're speaking to a person rather than a set of
Thank you.
initials. Thank you so much. This has been really interesting, and all of the research and stats that you've thrown at us and like, all of those insights has kind of, I'm sure, really got everybody thinking. I guess it's kind of a comment dash another question to everyone really, but I'm kind of struck by the fact that inherently this group is a group of interested, willing practitioners who are going out of their way to try and be in a space that is thinking about how to work with girls and how to improve that practice. I guess I'm just interested in what your, Jennifer, or others' reflections are about the people that aren't in this space. It strikes me that there's potentially other practitioners out there, be them within youth justice services or within their partners, who wouldn't take the time to attend something like this or to potentially create that headspace that we've been talking about. So I guess the question is kind of, how do we get everybody interested in this beyond the amazing people here that are kind of really kind of taking the additional time and effort to do that thinking, because it seems like with the numbers being so small as they are at the moment, like it's already challenging to find that space. But how do we make sure that everybody who might be interacting with or making decisions about girls kind of starts thinking about it in the way that those on the call do?
Yeah, it's a huge challenge, isn't it, Pippa? And it's sort of, it's one of those things, isn't it, where you feel like you're repeating the same message time and time again. And even us, as many of us women, many of us practitioners who work with girls, who want desperately to do something for girls, are sort of, sometimes we forget as well, don't we, because we accept those norms in society, and that's just a reality and how it is. And when we think about, for example, how those stereotypes are just so internalized, and that bias is so unconscious often in education, in the sort of wider partnership. In terms of how we do that, I mean, one of the things we are doing at the YJB, and the sort of the purpose of this group and bringing together practitioners, is one of the ways in which we're seeking to do that and to get that back out to services. And I suppose another element is using some of the sort of appetite, I suppose, with the government's mission-led approach to violence against women and girls is a key tool for us to sort of use that to push that forward and to challenge that. I think it's a case of not giving up. It's a case of those repeated messages. I think it's really important in management boards. We've been looking internally in the YJB at different ways that we can do this at a strategic level and an operational level. But there is a lot of work to be done. I don't know if others have got other thoughts on that in terms of how we get that message and how we put that challenge out there. On Pippa.
I just, maybe while others are taking a sec to think about it, I don't want to butt in again, but just to let you know, Jennifer, and everyone on the call, I'm considering exploring doing some research about that specifically kind of looks at how do we consider what a child first approach looks like for girls. I'm going to be turning that around pretty quickly, but if yourself or anyone else that's interested on the call would be interested in being involved in that, I would really be keen to engage with those in this group to throw some extra funding and capacity at this kind of cause really, and try to work with everybody that's interested in that to kind of develop that and share that further.
I think that would be very welcomed. Thank you. Thanks, Pippa. I think that would be very welcomed. I'm certainly happy to be involved, and I'm sure many would. So we can absolutely share, if you want to pass on your details, and we can kind of share those via this forum. Sherry.
I was just enthusiastically saying I'm interested in that.
Was it a thumbs up rather than a hands up?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure there will be. And we can absolutely use this as a means of getting, because we've got a good number of services involved in this group as well. So that it is quite a wide you know, a wide reach in terms of that, which is fantastic. But, you know, also through our operations team, we've got the ability to kind of reach management boards and so on as well. So we've got some reach within the sector, which is fantastic. Tracy.
All I was going to say, rather than everyone put their email for Pippa to pick up, what I'll do is I'll put Pippa's email in the notes that come out to all of you, and then you can contact her outside of this meeting. It's interesting because Pippa gave me a challenge a while ago, actually, that I very much took on board, which is, how do people know about the group? You know, those that know, but how do other people know about the group? Those kind of things. And it is something that I do think about quite a lot. Interestingly, I mean, we've definitely got every region covered. Whether we've got every youth justice service covered in this group, I don't think so. But my distribution list is massive. But very often people are busy, they can't attend, they've got kind of casework, crises has come up, the emails coming in this morning like, really sorry, can't make it, really sorry, can't make it. But this is very much a practitioner group and rich for that, not absolutely a criticism, but it's those higher level conversations as well. The girls' report came out that Susanna's done, that makes a number of really good recommendations. Actually, I did say I was going to reference all those other recommendations earlier, so let me just do that now. I won't put up a slide. So in terms of the other recommendations, the number one is end placements of girls in YRIs. That's been accepted. I don't need my hand up anymore. That's been accepted, so that won't be happening anymore. But actually, Susanna's gone further, and which is a recommendation that all girls should be placed in either secure children's homes or in the secure school, that they don't get placed in secure training centres anymore. That is still subject to feedback and reflection. Actually, also a need to develop a girls' consortia with children in custody and others. A need for a national pathway for girls, which is thinking much more about making better use of those things that already exist in legislation but aren't well used, so such as intensive fostering, those kind of things. A greater consistency of good practice for girls who self-harm. A lot of self-harm management is about stopping girls self-harming. And actually, this is for a lot of girls an emotional management strategy. It might be very uncomfortable to see, but for these girls, that self-harm is serving a purpose. So it's about thinking about how that can be managed in a more consistent approach that's more in the secure estate. And the final call from Susanna was the need for a girls' strategic board, and for that girls' strategic board to read across to the women's board, because sometimes girls' needs are different, sometimes they're the same. And my concern about the women's board has always been that women will subsume the voice of girls. So actually there's a recommendation to look at a specific girls' strategic board, which will link in to the women's board. So there is some movement in that strategic space as well. The government has got, they've accepted the first recommendation. To be fair, girls haven't been in Wetherby for a little while, so relatively easy recommendation to accept, but really great that it's happening. Let's see how those other recommendations go. But Susanna has gone outside of just the secure estate and thinking of what needs to happen for girls in a wider setting. We're definitely seeing girls in that prevention space, but there is still a small number in that formal court, out of court disposal and post court space. So I just thought I'd mention that, because I did say I would talk about the recommendations from that report at the beginning, and it occurred to me I hadn't done that. So sorry, back to the conversation in terms of assessment, what we're doing differently about assessing girls, and those conversations about, and I know a couple of you have asked about setting up girls groups. There are a number of girls groups out there. I've put some links into the Resource Hub girls groups. But if anyone wants to share their knowledge about if they are delivering girls groups, we heard, if you haven't already seen the recording of the last Girls Forum, it's on the Resource Hub. I think it might be on YouTube as well. It's on the Resource Hub, and that talks about two girls' experience actually, but actually one girl was one-to-one work, but one of the other girls also went through a group work program, and she talks about her experience of that group work program. So you can hear about that girl's experience and how what she got out of that group. And another previous group, we've had a presentation from Valerie from Birmingham. I don't know whether you're on the group today, Valerie, and Coventry, who also have been running girls groups really successfully for quite some time. I think the top tip is, and this is a theme that's come out, is even if you get small numbers to start with, hang on in there, build it, and they will come. Because it's really easy to get kind of dejected about, oh, well, only one girl's turned up or only two girls have turned up. But actually, it's about really hanging on in there so that the girls know you're there. They can come to that group, and it will build. So I don't know if anyone wants to kind of comment on that, or if you are delivering girls groups, anything you want to say about that. I'm only pausing so you can turn your mics off and put your cameras on. Abigail, you decide.
Yeah, either. Thanks, Tracy. Tian and I did a presentation a couple of groups ago about the girls' work that we're doing in Coventry. And top tip from me would be, we joined up with a local charity who also run stuff like that, so we weren't just carrying the whole weight of it ourselves, because we all know things are busy. So if you've got sort of local CICs or charities or partners that can co-deliver something like that, it really helps to sort of share that load, plus you get to tap into their expertise because they are looking at things through a different lens but with the same goal in mind. So we found that really helpful.
Thanks, Abby. Okay, so there's a couple more things I just want to say before I do the formal thank yous. For me, this has been really powerful. It really makes you think about girls' life experience and what they bring with them. So when you're sitting with that girl sat in front of you, it's not just she's a 15-year-old girl. It's about she's a 15-year-old girl who will have experienced these things in terms of this is what it's like to be a girl growing up. There's a possibility she could have experienced some of those things. And there's a possibility that she might have experienced some of those other things. And I know the time is precious when you're doing assessments. I know you're all really aware of thinking about identity and those kind of concepts, but I'll just ask you to carry that with you when you're doing those assessments, to think about what those girls' life experiences are when they come with you. You might not know it all at that beginning. It sometimes comes out as you build the relationship with the child and get to know that girl much, much better. I'm also going to say, don't forget some of the boys in all of this, and actually some of the data doesn't apply. The data will be very different, but in terms of black boys, mixed race boys, it's not just about this is a boy, 15-year-old black boy. It's about what they come with, that all those life experiences that they come with, which will have driven how they see the world. So all of those life experiences that girls come with will have driven how they see the world, how they connect with people, how ready they are to build trust, how they can build those relationships. I'm also kind of reflecting on BCEs, which is kind of a new language to me, but people will be aware of it, kind of benevolent childhood experiences, and actually the strength that having a key person in children's lives can be, that can protect children about some of the kind of bad life experiences they have. And actually, I think youth justice workers probably might find themselves in some of that space. Teachers definitely are, in terms of protecting children from those, that building that relationship can protect children from some of the more significant harm they might experience. So that's what I wanted to say about that. It's really carrying those girls that you're doing those assessments with you, they're carrying all of that with them when they come into that room, when they come into that space. So it's making sure you're thinking about all of those things as well. So thank you for that. So can I thank Jenny and Fiona for their session today? Really thought-provoking. I've taken a huge amount out of it, so I hope you have too. I'm going to stop for a virtual round of applause. I'll do a real one. Thank you very, very much. Really appreciate it. We will continue with these sessions, but very much these are driven by you guys. So we've had 2 external speakers today. Well, one YJB spoke, one external speaker. We really want this to be your space. So what we would like to do the next session on is girls as victims. And thinking about their experience of being victims. So either the offer that you might have to girls as victims, or just those thinking about keeping girls safe as victims, those kind of things. So we literally can't do it without you. So please, 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 if any of you are working in that space at all, please get in touch with me, and let's look at doing the next session. You can have a slot in the next session. You've seen they're a friendly bunch, so you can absolutely be in a safe space. So you don't worry about if you're not used to presenting. We will look after you, I promise you that. So if you've any volunteers, please, we cannot run this group without you. This is with you and for you. So please let me know if anyone's happy to do a session on the next one. They take place about quarterly, with regards, and the theme we want to pick up is girls as victims. So thank you very much, everybody. Unless there's anything else, I'll pause just in case there is anything else that people want to either put in the chat or ask of Jenny or myself, because Fiona's gone. No, all right. Well, we'll get the recording out to you somehow. Magic will happen, and it will kind of get edited, and it will go on the resource hub, and it will come out to you. The PDF of the information that Jenny's put together will go on the resource hub and come out to you. Anyhow, you'll get a bundle of stuff, but you won't get it until at the very earliest at the tail end of next week, just because of life. But we will get it out to you. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a lovely day. Good luck with the work that you're doing with the girls. It's important stuff, and we really value it. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.